Alright guys, time for a little late night work here. Going to look at global age and exploration and the expansion of the world, getting away from just Eurasia and Africa and moving out to a greater sense of the world itself. So we got to look at it. We know this from our past history, but what was the motivation for exploration? And what most people know it is three G's: God, glory, and gold. The idea of spreading Christianity, primarily Catholic Christianity, and then eventually moving on into Protestant Christianity with the advent of the Reformation. The glory, the fame that these explorers wanted, and the glory of these empires that were trying to be built, whether it be by Portugal or Spain, the Dutch East India Company, English, I mean, whatever you're looking at, the glory is going to be huge there. And of course, the wealth, the gold. I mean, those are major motivations, but it's not just gold, it's spices, it's silver, it's porcelain, it's ivory, it's a lot of stuff that's going to be going back and forth between the continents. So, okay, let's look at those major motivations for exploring the seas. And the first one, obviously, is the population of Europe was rising. I say obviously, it really isn't obviously, but the population of Europe is rising. It's getting greater, it's getting bigger, and they need more. They need to have room for expansion. You know, we're coming out of the Black Death. Hygiene is better. Cleanliness is better. We have medicinal powers that are helping people stay healthier. They've got to go somewhere to live, and they've got to have more food to survive. Okay, people wanted spices, the preservation of food, medicines, perfumes. It's a whole change in culture now because of it. And the spice trade, especially peppers and cloves and nutmeg and cinnamon, all that stuff's going to come right back into Europe and be huge for profit. And we look at capitalism down the road. These spices are going to bring major profits to those countries and to those companies that are doing it. All right. One place they're going to focus on is the Molucca Islands, the Spice Islands. If you look here on this map, this is an older map of the Moluccas. The Moluccas are essentially Indonesia, Malaysia, Southeast Asia, down in that South China Sea, Indian Ocean basin area, and that's where the major spices are. And it's going to be a major area for trade in that southern part. Okay, and then lastly, I'll scroll this up a little bit for you. The European countries wanted to avoid contact with the Italians, especially the Venetians, and Muslim traders that are avoiding that Silk Road trade. You know, here we are going to start looking at Indian Ocean trade basin and how it connects to the Silk Road, how it connects to the trans-Sub-Saharan trade networks. All right, but they want to avoid the Muslim traders because they don't really want to deal with them anymore. They definitely want to avoid the middlemen of the Venetians. So here, with this direct access to Asia, it's going to bring major wealth to the people, to those countries. So when we look at exploration, we got to start with Portugal. And Portugal is really going to begin to start sailing around the coast of Africa in the mid-15th century, and then finally making it to India by the late 15th century with Vasco da Gama. And the guy who's really going to promote this is Prince Henry the Navigator. He is going to be the sponsor for exploration. And understand, he did not navigate anywhere. He did not go on ships. That was not his purpose. His purpose was building schools. His purpose was teaching people navigation. His purpose really was being the money man and the value that's going to come out of being the money man. Okay, so here's Prince Henry the Navigator. He's going to establish island ports off the coast of Portugal, places like the Azores, Cape Verde Islands, the Canaries. Okay, and he's beginning to create ports along the North African coastline, really taking land or taking ports for his ships to go and train the movement down the sea, down the ocean, Atlantic Ocean side of Africa, and try to get into the Indian Ocean side of Africa. All right. And what he's going to do is he's going to hire a ton of cartographers. These are map makers that are going to be used to map the African coastline. Once they know where the African coastline is, they know where the trade winds are coming, they're going to start to work real hard. One thing that's not mentioned in these notes is that they're going to build ships called caravels. And these caravels are going to be smaller ships carrying weapons that are going to move faster. And the big thing they're going to have on them is a lateen sail. And that lateen sail is a triangular shaped sail that helps them tack against the wind. As they're moving down the western coast of Africa on the Atlantic Ocean side, they're sailing against the prevailing winds, and it makes it very difficult for sailing to happen unless you have this lateen sail. All right, and the first person to make it down around the southern tip of Africa is a Portuguese sailor named Bartolomeu Diaz. Now, he is going to be the first one who rounds the Cape of Good Hope. And if I zoom in here for you on the Cape of Good Hope, all right, you have this point down in the lower half where it's a Cape of Good Hope, this southwestern tip that jutted out from the rest of the African continent. And these sailors will move around this cape to get into the southern part, obviously, of Africa. All right, and there's the Cape of Good Hope right there. But it definitely was a boundary point that could help The sailors know really where they were. Okay, and there's just a marking down there with the Cape of Good Hope as well. All right, from here, however, Diaz, who was trying to get to India, is not going to get to India. He's got a mutiny on his hands and he'll have to return back to Portugal. But the inspiration and the travel time, the trip is there to inspire other Portuguese sailors to begin to sail around South Africa and into the Indian Ocean trade basin. And here we're going towards India. And understand, like I mentioned before in class, India and the Indies are all one area to the white Christian European explorers. They are not necessarily just India. That's how they start grouping them together, which is why Columbus will call them Indians and make that vital mistake. Okay, so the person who's going to get into India or reach the western half of India over here, Mumbai, which will be Calcutta, is Vasco da Gama. Okay, Vasco da Gama here is portrayed in his portrait, signifies really the 3 G's. He's got his God with the cross around his neck. He's got the glory of being remembered and being in a portrait here, basically honoring him for what he had done. And then the gold, the wealth, you can see in his clothing and his armor. He's got the map down here in his hand and a scroll. You can tell he's standing on a ship in front of other ships and what will be ports for the Portuguese to land at to have their trading network. All right, now he will return with more spices and goods than the cost of the actual trip. 12 times the cost. It'll be extremely profitable, which Diaz and other Portuguese sailors will make this trip into the Indian Ocean basin happen very often, and not only just making the trip into the Indian Ocean basin, but more importantly establishing trading posts throughout the Indian Ocean trade basin. And they're going to have this vast trading empire that will essentially work as a sovereign state. They'll work on their own because it's an 11-month trip into the Indian Ocean basin. So it's very, very difficult for them to get information back and forth, but they are going to send the goods back, and this vast empire will be strong. Now, a big reason why the Portuguese are able to come into a vast empire in the Indian trade basin is because they're carrying guns into the Indian Ocean trade basin. Muslim trading ships did not carry guns. That was not their purpose. Their purpose was to trade. Here you have Da Gama and other Portuguese sailors, and of course the Portuguese trading companies bringing guns in and really working as a country that is in trade more than a trading group. That's a big difference why the Europeans are really going to change the trade down in the Indian Ocean basin. All right, so when you look at Portugal, you got to look at Spain as well. The big person obviously is Christopher Columbus, of which we just celebrated Columbus Day, of course very controversially with him being seen as a killer of indigenous people, but also understand that he made a major decision to sail westward. On the Ptolemaic map, what Columbus is looking at, he sees that the Atlantic Ocean is not very large and he can get to China very quickly. So his job is to convince people that they can sail west across the Atlantic in a very quick time period and cut down his travel time and get to China and make the trade in the South China Sea, maybe have interactions with Japan and get into Malaysia and Indonesia where there's a lot of profit to be made in the spices. And it takes a lot of convincing. Okay, so his plan is to sail to the East Indies by sailing across the Atlantic, not knowing how large the Atlantic was, of course, but the idea that he can get there relatively quickly, cut down time, and avoid dealing with the Portuguese. However, his first stop is to put the Portuguese, but the Portuguese will not support him. They already have a plan on how they're going to get into the Indian Ocean trade basin. They're working very effectively. So what he has to do is convince Ferdinand and Isabella multiple times over and their advisors to give him the money, the funding, to get him into the Indian Ocean trade basin by allowing him to sail west. And because Ferdinand and Isabella were afraid of falling behind, they give him that money. And they give him the ships that he needs, and he goes off on his 3.5-month journey. And the hope is for a lot of wealth, power, and spread of religion. Again, God, glory, and gold becoming the main part of what the monarchs wanted here. You're talking about the most Catholic monarchs of Europe in the 15th century, or at least the title that is given to them. And this is what they're hoping for. Of course, they really want to spread their empire as well and spread Christianity, hence they've been eradicating Islam and Judaism in their own country for years. Spread Christianity, spread Catholicism, and get new converts. Okay, so as Columbus goes westward, he's going to run not into China or the Southeast Indies, but he's going to run into the unknown Caribbean islands. Specifically, in his first travel, he is going to go to the Bahamas. And when he steps off the ship, he is going to call these people Indians, which is a big misnomer, a big mistake. Hence the reason all native populations and aboriginal populations across the world have been called Indians. He thought he was in the Indies. And again, he wasn't even going to an area where there were Indian people. He was going into Indonesia, which is a completely different area. Okay, that's at least what he thought. Now, understand, when Columbus in his diary, he writes and says that these are wonderfully built people. They are very attractive. They're handsome. They are very good at they're young, they're healthy, they're going to be very good slaves, is what he believes, and he can make them converts to Christianity. He is going to do the will, he believes, of the Holy Father, the Holy God, and his holy Catholic monarchs. In turn, what he's actually going to do is rape, pillage, and steal. However, you got to give him some credit, even though he went the wrong way. He does open up the new trade of the Columbian Exchange, because he's going to find resources that had not been previously found, and it's going to bring a lot of wealth back and forth to Spain. A lot of people are going to start coming across the ocean and settling and colonizing, and even though it's not for a good reason, or it's a good reason to colonize, not a good reason what's going to happen to the indigenous people there, and then subsequently the Africans that are going to be brought over. But it does open up this global expanse, and that's a major positive in his factor, which of course gives him his title and his honoring on Columbus Day. All right, here's a map of his trips. The first trip is going to take him from the Bahamas back along the coast of Cuba. He's going to return along the Puerto Rican coast, Hispaniola, which is the Dominican Republic, and Haiti, and of course along the coast of Cuba and Jamaica before he heads back. Establishing colonies, bringing people with him, bringing resources back to him, back with him. He returns again in 1498 along the northern coast of Venezuela and Colombia, before he goes back towards his colonies in the Dominican Republic and in Puerto Rico and returns. And then lastly in 1502 to 1504, where he goes along the Yucatan Peninsula into the modern-day Central America, Nicaragua, Honduras, Costa Rica, Panama, and modern-day Colombia, of course, named after him, before he returns to Europe. Now, sadly enough, Columbus is going to die a poor man who is jailed and seen as a criminal rather than a hero. But he does open up a new world. Once 1492 hits and he returns in 1493 and people realize that he was very successful, more and more explorers are going to start rushing across the ocean. And that's a really big deal because it's going to expand population and expand trade. All right, which will subsequently lead to the Treaty of Tordesillas. Now, we've got a big issue here, and this is a line of demarcation. You have two very powerful empires with the Spanish and the Portuguese, and they're rivals here on the Iberian Peninsula, and now they want to claim control of the world, and they look towards the Pope. Obviously, they're both Catholic countries. They look towards the Pope. In this case, you're looking at Pope Alexander VI, who is a Spanish Pope. This is Rodrigo Borgia, who is very pro-Catholic monarchs. However, especially to Ferdinand and Isabella, since he is Spanish. However, he does appease the King of Portugal as well, and what he decides is that Spain will have the western half of the line of demarcation, and Portugal will have the eastern half of the line of demarcation. And you can see where the line was in 1493 and then moved over a year later in 1494, because the Portuguese will settle here along what is the Brazilian coast, but the Spanish will have this general area of the Americas to themselves, really, to expand upon, and the Portuguese will have the eastern half of South America, and of course the ports along Africa and into the Indian Ocean trade basin. And essentially, the Pope declares that all the non-Christian world is going to be split up between these two countries. Of course, it's going to bring France and make them very upset, make England very upset, the Holy Roman Empire, and other groups that are Christian groups in Europe very upset, and of course brings the view of the Pope down dramatically and really hurts his cause. Even King Charles V will try to invade Naples by trying to go through and attack the Vatican and the Papal States. And of course, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella will have to bail Borgia out by sending their troops in to stop them. So it's going to lead to a lot of conflict down the road. And we're going to talk about that conflict and some other sailors as we move along.